Hello, welcome to Lesson 2 of Quilting Basics, half square triangle blocks, pillows, and quilts.
If you remember, in Lesson 1, we left off where we had just finished making our pinwheel quilt block. And you thought we were done, but we did have one more step. We were just waiting till Lesson 2 to show you it. We want to square up that finished quilt block that we did. So let's do that first, and then we're gonna go over some of the layout of our quilt and the specifics of what you will need to make this quilt top if you want to make this exact one.
Exactly. Lesson 2 is all going to be about how to put our blocks together, create sashing, and make it all work so it's going to be a finished quilt top.
And we're even going to teach you what sashing is.
Yes.
It's a word not many people know, even some people who've been quilting a while.
That's true.
All right, so we're back to our pinwheel block that's right here, and if you'll notice, it's pretty well square. It looks like this side's pretty good, so I'm actually going to line that side up. But if you'll notice down here, we've got a little bit off on these edges. So we're going to do the exact same way, and Liz, I'm going to use your glove.
All right, before we do this though, maybe we should give it a good pressing.
Oh, let's do that first.
Before we square up our block.
We ended up with that, but let's, especially here in the middle, it can get a little bit bumpy. And we wanted to show you one more thing. Oops, let's move that over a little bit. Liz was talking that when we get to finished quilt blocks that sometimes we like to use some best press or some starch on there. And it just helps keep that fabric in place.
It makes it smell good too, which I like. The other thing is it's going to help, it's going to press all of that fabric out nice and taut when you're going to give it this last good pressing before you square it up. And that way when you're cutting, you're going to have your fabric pressed out as far as it actually can go. And that's going to help you get the most accurate cutting that you can get.
And when I was on the other side, I could see one of these back seams was turned. So all I did was flip it back over and push that back seam to where I wanted it to go. And then I can come back to the front and just give it one final great pressing.
Perfect.
Okay, now we are ready to square.
Yay.
And use your glove.
And use my glove. I like these gloves. Elizabeth doesn't. I do. I've had a couple cutting mishaps.
I should use it more.
And it's a great tool to use. You put it on your hand that's going to hold your ruler, and that way as you're cutting along, if you accidentally slip because maybe your rotary cutter is dull and you're sitting on your kitchen floor and you're pressing really hard and you slip.
How would you know these things?
I don't know how I would know these things. And if you go across your hand, then you won't need stitches. So
it's a
great tool to have. Even sometimes when I'm going along and I just nick, I've cut off fingernails before just nicking across. So
use your glove.
I'm going to give, yes, if you have a safety glove, I would use it. And I do.
All right, so we're just going to do the exact same method we did before, where I'm going to find that one side that was pretty well square. And then all I'm going to do is just square up.
Move that so you can see the top of your ruler.
And honestly, I really just took a small area off that one. The finished size of these blocks are going to be 11.5 inches because we started with 6-inch half square triangle units. So I'm just going to go right to that spot.
And again, she's not taking off a lot of fabric, but just these little tiny pieces make all the difference in the finished product of your quilt. Almost there.
And we have one more side. We'll turn and do this. Liz was saying earlier you are going to be tempted to skip this. We all are. We're tempted to skip the pressing and the squaring because we're in such a hurry to get to finishing our quilts and doing the fun part. And sometimes this isn't the fun part, but it really does make a big difference in a great looking quilt.
It does. Okay, it's nice and square.
We've got that all ready. And if you are going to make the quilt that's behind us, the one that we showed you with the modern pinwheels, you're going to need 16 of these blocks. We have used 7 different fabrics. That's not a rule. It's just the coordinating fabrics that we like together. So you could use 5, you could use 10, you could even pull out your scrap bins and do all 16 a different pinwheel.
It's true. The other thing that I was going to say too is we did 7 because we wanted to have a nice random pattern. We didn't want to have 2 colors that were next to each other, and 7 seems to be a great number to work with as far as having a variety of fabric. So it was 7 colors mixed with the white.
And we like odd numbers in fabrics. I don't know.
We do like odd numbers.
We do. So if you want to make this exact one, you will need 16 pinwheel blocks. And then if you'll notice the quilt behind us, we have arranged them in 4 rows of 4. So it is a square quilt, and it's a great lap size quilt. It would be perfect for TV or movie night, or even hanging on the wall. It's a great size for that.
It's a perfect size. And you'll notice besides the blocks, also something else that we've added there, and that is called sashing. Sashing are the pieces that go in between the blocks. Sashing does several things. Lots of people like to add it for a design element. Where we've just used the sashing with white fabric and kind of had it blend in, a lot of people use it for a design element with a contrasting color or a pattern, and they add other things called cornerstones, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, to also give it some extra interest. For us, we added sashing in a more traditional way on our modern quilt to just give our quilt some more body and some extra room. The sashing just makes the width of our quilt larger instead of just having the blocks pressed together.
And I love the white space that it gives a quilt. I love white space in quilts. Everyone develops their own personal styling in quilt, and I really love to just let the fabric, if I want to showcase a fabric, I love to showcase that fabric and then leave a little white space around it so that it will draw your eye into those pinwheels that are going around. The other thing that you will notice on the quilt is that we really just did a random design. There's not madness or a method. Usually when we're quilting, I just take all 16 blocks, lay them out on the floor, stand up, change a few, go back and look at it, move them around again until I get a design that I like. A lot of people, that would drive them crazy. You can do a pattern if you want, but you don't have to. It's all up to you.
Exactly. All right, well, let's start putting this guy together. The next thing we're gonna have to do is make our sashing.
We are. So we need to cut our sashing. If you'll notice, I'm just gonna pull these right in here. So these are enough of our quilt blocks that we have 1 row. And what you're going to do is measure your quilt blocks. I've already measured these, but if you have a different size, or if your pinwheel blocks have come out a little bit different size, the first thing that you're going to need to do is measure. So we know our blocks are 11.5 by 11.5. So that's what we're going to cut for the length of our sashing. And then this quilt I've used 3 inches, which will finish up to about 2.5 inches.
Exactly. And that's a pretty standard size that we like to use. That's one of our favorite sizes for sashing.
But again, it's personal preference. If you wanted to go bigger to give it more white space, or if you like littler white space, you could push them closer together.
Exactly. All right.
Okay, so let's move those for a second. We
Sort
showed
out
you
the way.
in lesson 1 how to cut your fabric. We're going to cut it the exact same way for this. I'm just going to move our iron and ironing board
all the
out a
way
little
out.
bit so we've got a little bit more room for this bigger piece of fabric.
Now it's during this time where I'm cutting these long strips of fabric that I actually really do use my safety glove. For smaller cuts, I don't always do that. But for these longer cuts, that's when I usually use this.
And one tip or trick I like to do, and we've tried to do it a little bit here, but this fabric has been folded a long time, is just to give your sashing fabric a good press before you start, just to get all of the wrinkles out, and you'll get a nice, smoother, cleaner cut.
All right.
So I'm going to line this up exactly like I did before. You probably won't cut off as much fabric as I'm cutting off right now, but I want to end on a number right there. So I'm just going to again square up that side.
Which is great. That was wavy fabric there on the end, but now it's nice and smooth.
And then I'm just going to cut my 3-inch pieces. Again, I would cut all of my sashing at one time. It's just a time saver. You're kind of going to do everything in steps. I'm just going to cut 2 of these for right now. Actually, we're going to need 3. I'm going to cut 3.
And to create this quilt, you would need to cut quite a few more. And you're actually going to cut some, we might need to cut a few more pieces for when we get to the long.
Oh, let's do 2 for the long.
When we get to the long areas. You're going to have some short sashing strips and you're going to have some long sashing strips. And we'll show you why that is here in just a few seconds.
All right, so I'll move the rest of this out of the way. And then just how I just like to cut. Do you do the same where you do all of the long rows first and then you go back and cut the shorter pieces? And I tend to just, let's keep these for our longer pieces over here.
Okay, I will steal those.
We're gonna need those in just a couple seconds.
We'll come back to long pieces towards the end.
And then again, I'm just lining these up on those horizontal lines so I know that I have this straight. Speaking of the other day, I finally cut through my cutting mat.
Oh, that was bound to happen.
It was bound to happen. It has had a great life. I do use my cutting mat every single time that I quilt.
And you'll find that once you start quilting and using your cutting mat, there are certain lines that you will cut on over and over again. And pretty soon, one day, before you know it, you're going to be cutting all the way through your mat.
It was time.
No matter how great your mat is.
I know, all the mats are great because they are self-healing. But after you've cut the same line a couple thousand times,
it just can't hold
time
up.
for a new one. Okay, so I'm starting right here, and I need to count over 11 and a half, and I really do use my finger a lot because 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Did I do that right, Liz?
I don't know. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11.
Okay, 11 and a half. Here we go. It's the whole measure twice, cut once. 2 people measuring is bound to be correct. All right, so we've got our 11 and a half pieces, and these aren't quite long enough for 11 and a half, so I would just press them open, put the other one on top of it, and then cut 2 more.
That's exactly what I would do.
And we had enough to do our first row, so we'll move these guys out of the way.
Okay, let's grab our pinwheels for our first row. And then let's pick an order to put them in. Do you have big feelings about this order?
I don't. I like really random quilts sometimes. Sometimes you know that I can be a little bit of a perfectionist.
Yes.
But
and you like everything symmetrical.
I do. But then again, sometimes I can go random. Looks great.
Okay, I think we'll separate the chartreuse and the mustard a little bit. Okay.
So if you'll see, we're having a space
let's
problem.
Let's move it down here a little
Okay.
bit. Make it easier for everyone to see.
So if you'll see that our sashings are just gonna fit right in between our 2 quilt blocks, right like this. And then all we're going to do is sew them in between. So that all you have to do is turn this over. I'm gonna pin because I'm a pinner.
She loves to pin.
And then
Only 2 pins.
only 2 pins.
Wow. And then she's going to hand it to me so I can sew this together. Again, I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam, and I'm going to do something that seems a little bit counterintuitive. I'm going to flip this upside down, and I'm going to put the sashing here on the bottom and my quilt block at the top. And as I'm sewing it down, Elizabeth is going to explain why in the world I did this.
So we know that our quilt block is what we need to measure to. And sometimes if we haven't cut our sashings to be perfectly even, they could be a tiny bit longer. So if you ever have a piece that you're trying to join to something that you know is stable, that you've starched and pressed, you always want to put that piece on the bottom because that's where the feed dogs of your sewing machine are. So the feed dogs kind of help gather up a little bit of that extra fabric, and it helps make it fit better, especially on those long sashing pieces that are between the rows of the quilt. You're always going to want to sew with those on the bottom just because those feed dogs can help gather up some of that excess fabric.
That was perfect, because now I'm done. All right. Now again, we're on camera, so we're using red thread. Normally we would not choose to use red thread.
It would be white.
It would be white. All right, that said, here's that guy.
One thing to point out in quilting is that we always kind of start with smaller units and work towards bigger units. So if you'll remember back to lesson 1, we started with our smaller half square triangle unit, and then we sewed 4 of them together to make our bigger quilt block. Then from quilt blocks, we're going to sew into rows. So we're joining quilt block number 1 to sashing number 1 to quilt block number 2 to sashing number 2. If you kind of get that in your mind as you're going through quilting, so you're starting with smaller units and then making them into bigger units, into rows, and then rows into quilt tops.
Exactly. All right.
Here's our second guy. And I won't even pin
I was
for
going to
you.
say no pins.
You won't
this
even have
time?
to take out a pin.
No pins.
Liz and I learned to sew very differently.
Very differently.
I learned to sew from a mom and a grandma and a fantastic home ec teacher who kind of gave me my own class when I was in middle school and let me sew whatever I wanted to. But all of those ladies were very big into sewing rules and learning to do things the right way, which I very much appreciated.
And you very much follow to this day.
I do. I had good women as examples of sewists. So I learned to sew when I was in about 7th grade, and then sewed through middle school and at home during high school. And then I wish I would have continued. It's kind of one of my regrets, but I didn't. And so I kind of left it and pursued a teaching career for a while. But then I found myself after I had finished college and teaching and had married, and after I'd had my first child, I decided it was time to stay home. And so I did, but I found myself at home doing laundry and changing diapers and doing dishes and changing diapers and doing laundry and changing diapers, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate.
It's a never-ending cycle.
It is a never-ending cycle.
It's a good cycle, but it's never-ending.
And so I found myself needing something, and so I actually borrowed Liz's sewing machine, which was in a box in her basement. She'll tell you the
We'll
story
talk
why.
about that in a minute.
So I borrowed her sewing machine, and I began sewing things for my baby. And I sewed bibs and baby blankets and car seat covers and ragged baby quilts and all of those different things, and caught the bug again. And that little baby will be 14 this year.
I can't believe he's that old.
I know. So he was kind of my inspiration to start sewing again, but after he was born, then I had a little girl. And it's kind of all over when you sew for a little girl, because there's fancy dresses and skirts and all of those types of things to sew for. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, after doing garment sewing for so long, I got into quilting. And
You've
the
never
rest
looked
is
back.
history,
Yeah.
I guess. But Liz has a very different story.
I, like Elizabeth, had terrific women who are going to help me learn how to sew. But
Liz always cries.
I always cry.
We're always used to
I
this.
always cry. But I didn't listen to them. For years, I didn't listen to them. Because I was too cool to be domestic. Like, that was something I never wanted to be. I was an art major in college, and I wanted to teach art and make art, and anything domestic or crafty was, like, beneath me. And
We always say we probably wouldn't have been friends in high school.
we would not have been friends in high school.
We had to become friends because we were sister-in-laws, but we probably wouldn't have been friends in high school.
No. So actually, my first married Christmas, my mom thought, oh, Elizabeth will settle down now because she's married. So she gave me a sewing machine for Christmas. And I cried. How did my mom not know me? How did she not know me? That was so 1950s and so nothing I was interested in. So it went into my basement for several years till Elizabeth married in the family and needed to borrow a sewing machine, which she did. Meanwhile, I was teaching art and loving every second of it. And then I'll cry again because I had my first child who totally screwed up my life in the best way possible. I didn't know I wanted to be a mom. I didn't know I wanted to be domestic. I didn't know I would ever be interested in the cycle of dishes and laundry and changing diapers and wanting to sew or create a home. And all of a sudden, I found out that was inside me and I wanted to do that. And it was horribly shocking. And I kind of had to go through a period of what has happened to me. This baby has ruined my brain. I ended up stopping teaching and staying home, loving every second of it, sewing, quilting. My next two children were both girls. Again, it was all over in the world of sewing for me. I just wanted to sew dresses and skirts and all sorts of crazy things. The way that I ended up actually getting into sewing when I realized that this is the thing I wanted to do is my mom dragged me to a quilting class. So I actually learned to quilt before I learned to sew. Both my mom and grandma were quilters, and so that was something that my mom was like, okay, Liz can do this. A little skeptical at first, but I went because my favorite soda joint was in the parking lot, and I thought, well, at least I can get a soda when all this is over. I did find out I loved quilting, and ever since then, I have been hooked. I love every second of it. I took my sewing machine back from Elizabeth, worked on that for years, and 5 sewing machines later, I have 2 sewing machines set up permanently in my house, so no matter what floor I'm on, I can always sew.
There's always a sewing machine.
That's right. I'm always close to my machine.
And then 5 years ago, actually it's probably been a little bit longer. I lose track of time.
I think it has been a little longer.
Over 5 years ago, after Liz and I had both started sewing, we decided to start a blog to kind of share with each other the projects that we were working on. And it really, at the beginning, just was, I need to remember how to do this. And so we would write a tutorial or a post on a project that we had been working on, and then I could work on the projects Liz was working on, and she could work on the projects I was. And how many years later, here we are, and it's still going, and we love it.
Yeah, before we knew it, we had like a little community, and I love it. I love that exchange of ideas with people on the internet that I would never have come in contact with in real life, but then there we are nerding out about fabric on the internet, and I feel like they're all my best friends.
Because
I love it.
It's a great place to be. It's a
all
great
my
place
best
to be.
sewing friends.
Well, and we always say we travel around and teach some classes here and there, and we always say that people who sew and quilt are the best people in the world. They're the nicest, absolutely the nicest.
They really are, because most of what is sewn and quilted is for somebody else. So everybody that we meet is always sewing and making something to give to somebody else.
It's a wonderful world.
It is.
Welcome to the world of quilting. We're so glad you're here.
I'm done crying and sewing the first row. Joy. Okay. All right, we are all sewn together, but you can see that even though we've got a row, before we can move on to our next guy, we're gonna have to even square up our rows a little bit.
And before we do that, let's press it.
Okay, let's press this guy.
So let's pull this pressing mat back over one more time.
When it comes time to put your quilt top together, you're going to be doing quite a bit of back and forth. Squaring up, pressing, sewing. It's just the way that it works.
It's the only exercise you're gonna get in quilting.
It is the only.
Is moving from your machine back to your ironing board.
We actually were reading the other night, someone was saying that they put their ironing board far away from where their sewing machine is so they get some exercise while they're quilting.
Oh, I just made a mistake, but let's point out what I did.
Okay.
I was pressing it this way, but I actually was not paying attention because I was listening to your story. I actually want to press towards the block.
And your block is going to have a tendency to want to take over and open towards your sashing, but we really want to not have our seams go towards the sashing because our sashing's the lighter color. So we'd like our sashing to lay over the top of our block instead of vice versa, even though the block would really like to open over the top of the sashing.
And my iron had turned off for a second, so you're just going to pretend like mine looks a little better than it does right now, but it'll heat up here in just a second. Okay, so
Okay,
we've got that,
perfect.
and then again, we would just turn it over, make sure everything is turned out, and give this another great press right here. And then just repeat that for the whole row of your row number 1 of your quilt.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, let me move this guy back out of the way.
Okay, we'll lay him back out so he's ready to talk about.
And Liz
right.
was pointing out that a couple of these needed to be trimmed a little bit. At that point, you're going to want to do that. You're going to trim up any of those stray sashings that got a little bit longer than your blocks. But the next thing that we need to do, and you'll see it on the quilt behind us, is add our row of sashing that goes in between each of the rows. So will you grab those?
Yep, so this is our long sashing I was talking about earlier, where I said we were going to have short sashing pieces. Now's the time for our long sashing pieces.
And I'm going to press up these last 4 so that we don't get those. Whoa!
We have like a escaping seam ripper.
Runaway
Holy
seam
smokes.
ripper.
Okay. Now, Elizabeth and I, we do quite a few things the same. There's a lot that's similar about us, but when it comes to our style of sewing, we're fairly different. And that...
She's a cowboy sewist.
I am a cowboy sewist. I'm just like, get her done. However's going to be the fastest way, that's how I'm going to do it. However is the correct method and precise, that's the way Elizabeth is going to do it.
Not always. I try. Sometimes
Okay.
it doesn't work out.
All right, so I'm going to tell you how I make my sashing. Listen to it. If it works for you, do it. This is the Liz cowboy method. And then Elizabeth's going to tell you 2 more methods, a more by the book method, and then a method that she also uses. When I make sashing that's going to be these long strips that go across, I like to do it as quickly as possible. So I will have taken my strips that I've already cut. I will put them right sides together, and I will sew them together. I'm not going to do it because we're going to show you 2 other methods. So I'm just going to show you what I would do. I would sew them together right here. And I would do this with about 5 or 6 strips of my sashing. Then I would press them open, and I would lay them, or I would actually not lay them. I would put
Here,
them.
this guy's ready, so I'll pull
thank
it
you.
back so everyone can see.
Oh, perfect. And what I would do is lay them on top of my row and sew up this row. When I get to the end down here, and this would be sewn together. Lay this out nice. So this would be sewn together. Once I got to the end of sewing, I would just whack that piece off even here, take my piece of sashing and start down on my next row. I'm not saying that that's the correct method to do it. I am saying that's how I do it, and it saves a heck of a lot of time.
I don't think we always say there's no quilting police. You can do it how you want. You just find a method that works for you and do it. We'll talk about 2 others. So if you want to, you could get a tape measure. You could measure along this whole line, and then you could piece all of your sashings to exactly what your quilt rows could be. Mm-hmm. Or I kind of do a little bit similar to Liz's, where I just take one long piece. I kind of guesstimate what this is going to be.
Okay, here's your long piece.
So I take one long piece, and then I take a second piece and cut it in half, because I know that that's approximately how much I'm going to need. So I just cut 18 inches off of this guy.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Let's do it. Let's do it exactly how you would do it.
All right, I've lost the scissors. I found them.
And then we'll get one finished long sashing piece done on this quilt.
So I just cut 1.5, which is guesstimating what I think the length of my sashing is going to be. Again, I do this exactly like Liz, just put these 2 ends together.
We'll sew this up.
The tricky thing with this is make sure there's little dots on the side of your salvages. Here, I can pull this one and see.
Here, we can show them right here when we cut this guy off.
So when you're sewing that, make sure that you're going past those little dots in your salvage. You don't want those in your sashing.
You don't, and even though they look tiny and like they wouldn't show up, they still show up.
I've had them sometimes.
Okay, there we go.
And again, we'll just cut this to about a 1/4 inch seam allowance right there.
And that's honestly how I do it. I don't take the time to cut off the selvage edge before I sew them up. I just sew them together and chop off that little hairy end.
I'm just gonna give this guy a really quick press over here. I just press mine to one side. Is that what you do as well?
We do something the same.
And then I do the same thing as Liz. I know this is going to be longer, so I just make sure I'm not on the selvage on this side, not on the selvage on that side, and then stitch them together.
All right, should we sew this guy up?
Let's do it.
Okay. Now these fabrics that we used are pretty bold fabrics, and they are on white fabric. Now sometimes, and I've done this in the past, where I have sewn up a white quilt with some bold fabrics, and then I've thrown it in the washing machine, and the fabrics bleed. And then I say bad words, and it's very sad. So there are a few things that you can do to prevent this from happening. And actually, I can't sew and talk very well, so I'm gonna make Elizabeth talk about that.
So the first thing that you can do is, if you want to, you could pre-wash all of your fabrics before you started cutting them. So you would wash all of your fabrics and then press them and then cut them. I don't do that because I get really anxious when I find great fabrics. I want to start immediately. So a lot of times I'll go straight into cutting. So there are a couple other options. There's a product called color catchers. I don't know if you've used those in your laundry before, but anytime I give a quilt as a baby gift, I put a little color catcher in with the quilt. And I always say, when you wash for the first time, use this color catcher. If you're using a really bold color like a red, I use two color catchers on that one. And this is my mom's method, is using salt in your washer. So she just adds, I don't know, about 1/4 cup of salt when she washes a quilt with really bold colors for the first time. And the salt is supposed to hold that together. I've never done it, but she swears by it.
She does. With the color catchers, I'm always a little bit nervous because I've had bad experiences in the past. So if my quilt is larger, I might put several color catchers in, probably overkill, but I just don't want to be sad when I pull my quilt out of the washing machine.
And some, you'll kind of learn over time that some fabrics tend to leave more dye in the water than others. Usually good quality cottons or good quality quilting cottons have less of a likely to do that, but just be careful. For example, if I was making an all red quilt, I really probably would take the time to do all of the pre-washing, because you don't want to make this beautiful quilt and then have all of it bleed, especially if you were doing red on white.
Yes.
That would be not fun.
That would be bad.
That would make you sad.
And naughty. Okay, as I'm sewing this, I just wanted to point out really quickly that I am doing how we talked about from lesson 1. I've put the long strip of the sashing underneath my quilt blocks again. Just as I'm pulling that through, I just wanted to point it out really quickly because I'm coming up here right on the end. I did a 1/2 inch, or not a 1/2 inch, excuse me, a 1/4 inch seam allowance again. And because we did not square up these rows, I feel like it's a little bit crazy, but I think it should be okay. I think it'll still press up okay for what we want to show you today. All right, here I come to the end. We'll cut that off. And then let's check out sashing on row 1. Let's open this guy up.
So here we have row 1 of our quilt, and then sashing on in between row 1 and row 2. One thing that I have found is that sometimes it's really hard to get row 2 on row 1 so that all of your seams of your pinwheel blocks line up perfectly. So I'm going to show you a trick that I use to do that. And basically it's really easy. You're just going to grab one of these. Here, let's use green. That might show up really well on this white fabric.
Perfect.
And again, we'll have to demonstrate how these just wash off. Or not wash off. They come off through heat.
They do, and I actually, these pins that we're using, I didn't believe that they came off through heat, and I called Elizabeth one night. I just ruined this quilt. I thought they were supposed to come off with water, and so I don't know why I thought that, so I called her
Well,
late.
some of them do. Some of them are like water soluble.
But not these ones. I thought I had ruined a whole quilt because I had marked up the whole top and had quilted one, and then I went to spray it down with water, and it didn't come off, and I had a freak out. And Liz said, just pull out your iron. Everything will be okay.
Just iron them. So I would take the time to press this. That's what you're going to do at home. So you're just going to press this sashing again towards your quilt blocks so that you can't see any of the white showing through underneath. We're just going to pretend that's already done on there. But you're going to do that at home. Take the time to do that. What I like to do is after I've sewn row 1, and then the sashing on it, I just like to mark where I know that my quilt blocks are going to go on row 2. So I just line up my quilting ruler even with the quilting block, and I just put a couple little lines where those are gonna go. I'll do one more set.
This really is a great trick.
It really works. I think even if you have the best of intentions to try and make sure everything is square and lined up, we're not perfect. We're not perfect quilters. There's always going to be mistakes. And so sometimes you're going to have to fudge this a little bit. And so all I do is put a pin on row 2 where these come into place. And then I know that I'm going to have straight seams going down my quilt this way. So that's what I do right there. The other thing that we need to talk about is that when we're quilting, when I first made a quilt, I sewed row 1, I did the sashing, I sewed row 2, I did the sashing, I sewed row 3, I did the sashing. And I ended up with a quilt that was a little bit going this way.
Which is pretty normal. It really is. But there's a way to fix that. There's a way to keep your quilt top from shifting. And it's super simple.
All you have to do is sew row 1, sashing 1, and then you're going to attach row 2. You're going to stop right there. And then you're going to move to rows 3, your sashing, and row 4, and then put them together in sections. So for this quilt, you'll just have 2 sections. You're going to sew row 1, sashing row 2, and then you're going to stop and do the bottom 2, and then join those 2 pieces in the middle, and you'll get a little bit more straight of a quilt.
Now the quilt that we made only has 4 rows. But let's say you're doing a quilt that has 8 rows or 10 rows, which is fairly common. When I do that, I like to sew my rows together with row 1 and 2, row 10 and 9, 3 and 4, back and forth all the way, and I like to start from each end and work towards the middle when I sew it together. And then that kind of helps me as well avoid doing the shifting, crazy quilt thing that's going on.
Yeah, so you're always just going to end with sewing the 2 bigger sides in the middle. It's just a tipper trick. If you want to do it the other way, you are a much better quilter than I am, because sometimes I do end up with the slanty.
It's true.
Sweet. All right, so after we've done, you will have all of your sashings in between. The last thing we need to do is add sashings to our top and our bottom of our quilt, as you can see behind. And then we've added the same amount of sashing on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the quilt.
And I kind of like to do this when I use sashing because it kind of frames in my quilt, kind of gives it a border. So it's something, if I'm doing sashing, I always like to put the sashing, the same size sashing on the sides and the top and the bottom. It's not necessary, but it's something I like to do.
And if you even wanted to make a bigger quilt, you could add that sashing on the top and the bottom as well as the sides, and you could do it again with the contrasting fabric or one of the colors in your pinwheel that you wanted to really show off, and do a bigger border around it if you needed to make the quilt bigger.
For sure. So the way that you're going to add those sashings onto the side and onto the top and bottom is exactly the way that we added our sashings in the middle. You can do my cowboy method where I sew it all together in big strips, sew it on, square it up, chop off the ends. You can do it Elizabeth's method where she guesstimates about how long it's going to be, or you can do it more by the book and measure from the top of your quilt to the bottom of your quilt, cut your sashing to that length, and then sew it onto the sides. It's whatever
method you choose.
Your personal preference.
Yep. So after you have done that, you will have your full and completed quilt top. If you need to trim off any of your sashings, do that at that point. And then you're going to want to give your quilt top a final pressing. I like to use spray starch at this point just because I feel like it keeps everything in place and allow enough time to do that. Sometimes I'm kind of rushing through that final pressing, but give your quilt top one final great pressing to make it look good.
Right, and you're going to give it one final pressing because you're going to do one final squaring. You'll notice that every time, every step that we've gone through from making our half square units to our pinwheels, to our rows, every time we're squaring everything. And that's just because we want it to be as perfect as possible. As Elizabeth keeps saying, there is no real perfect, but we are trying our best to make it look as professional as possible. So Elizabeth has a great trick to easily square a quilt, especially if it's a square quilt like what we just made today. So we're going to pretend that this square of fabric is our square quilt. An easy way to square your quilt top would be to just take and lay out your quilt top right there on the floor and get your corners to touch. And I'm going to pass this off to you.
So sometimes you'll find that your sashing has kind of pulled away. I mean, this is a really square piece of fabric, but if your sashing has kind of made a bubble right here, or you've pulled it a little bit, you just want to re-square that up. So you're just going to line up your ruler with the edge, and you're just going to whack off that little piece. Mm-hmm. If you don't have that, I can just show you what I do right here. And you can kind of see that as you're sewing along, not everything has stayed. But if this method doesn't work, if your quilt isn't square, all I do is I go back, and I know this sashing is supposed to be 2.5 inches. So I will just find 2.5 inches on my quilting ruler, and then I'm going to line up my pinwheel blocks, the first one and the second one, on that 2.5. And then I can take my rotary cutter again and trim off this little bit of extra that's sticking off my quilt to square it up that way as well.
Yep. And either way, it's personal preference. I usually do the fold method because it's quicker and easier. This way is far more precise and will give you some better measurements. But either way,
we do both. Yep.
Either way would definitely work.
So now you have your totally completed quilt top. Can you believe you just made a quilt top? It's amazing how fast it goes.
It is, and once you make one, you're going to want to make 500 quilt tops. Promise.
It's addicting.
It is. So now that we have our quilt top, we're going to need to learn how to put it all together and make it a quilt, so we don't just have a big square of fabric. That is going to come in lesson 3. So thanks for joining us for lesson 2, and we'll see you in just a few minutes for lesson 3.